We're celebrating this year the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Riot, and that's frequently referred to as the beginnings of the gay rights movement. Stonewall was essentially the same thing to the gay movement that the March on Washington in 1963 was to the civil rights movement for black people. And it was a moment that this idea, which we had honed and developed what we wanted in the way of demands, civil rights demands. We wanted to have not lose our jobs, to be safe on the streets, you know, all these. There's no such thing, by the way, as a gay right. That's a big mistake. Gay rights was easy to say instead of civil rights for homosexuals. That is Stonewall, the moment that a tiny movement became a mass movement. It got picked up immediately, like in 1970 when there was a march here in New York. On the West Coast in Los Angeles, they had a Stonewall West march. So immediately the concept of Stonewall captured the imagination, and it sort of gave almost a brand name to the movement, which is being used to this day. Stonewall had an international impact because it fed into what I'm going to call an almost universal romantic myth. And that myth is that the people who have nothing stand up against, it's a David versus Goliath myth, all the way back to the Bible, where, you know, the small guy stands up against the giant. In this case, a minority, or poor people standing up against rich, minority standing against majority. And that's the reason that the myth became so totally popular. I was never against Stonewall, because Stonewall was the moment that this tiny movement wanted to be a big movement. What I was against was pursuing progress for our status in society through violence. The question is, I was quoted as saying, rocks through windows do not open doors. And that the way to find public acceptance was not to behave disorderly and go out and riot, but to pursue things through the kind of techniques that were used, nonviolent techniques that were used by Gandhi and used by the African American civil rights movement. And people do not understand that Stonewall happened in a very unusual time. In 1968, Martin Luther King had been killed, and there was absolute rage on the part of the black community. And all over the United States, in almost every town and city, but not in New York, there were riots, and people burned down their own neighborhood in anger. They burned all the bodegas and all these other stores. So when 1969 came, there were nothing but endless articles in the press that black people had actually shot themselves in the foot by going out and rioting and burning down their own neighborhood. Because the few jobs they used to have in the little bodega for local youth were no longer there. And because we had a liberal mayor, when there was disorderly conduct outside the Stonewall bar, which frankly was not so much rioting and burning and throwing of rocks, a lot of it consisted of partying, you know, celebrations, sort of a street party, a little bit raucous, you know, but not with any permit, but still not controlled. The police were on their best behavior. So once the press get here, and they have those stories like the Stonewall girls were kicking their hair in curls and doing chorus lines, kicking their feet up at the cops were on their best behavior. There's a TV camera. If the cops had whipped out a club and hit somebody over the head, that would have been the picture, the story the next day. Police were smart enough to know that all eyes were on them. So they were on their best behavior. Now, they talk about it raging on for days. That's only true to a limited extent. Because after the first night, I came over here on a Sunday night, literally not long after the raid itself, and there was very little activity, because what it was, there was such a police presence that when they see a group of 6, 8, 10, 12 people, they would go over and it would break up. So it was sort of like, I would say not like, they make it sound in the myth, like it was a raging battle on the streets for 5 days or something. It was not. It was heavy police presence with sort of guerrilla groups popping up here, and the police went after them. But what this caused was it really had gotten the gay community angry. Now, you have to understand, why Stonewall happened was not just because there was a police raid, not just because there was a mayor that kept the police under control when people protested that action, but it was also because the debate, the public debate, which we were having on the airways, had gone from how do we cure homosexuals because they're all mentally ill, and all psychiatrists agree on that. The question now was, are they ill or aren't they ill? Because Evelyn Hooker had done studies that showed that there were apparently a group of 50 well-adjusted men, half of them gay, half of them straight. They gave them Rorschach tests, and they gave them to the experts to grade, and the experts determined that all 50 were what they appeared to be. They were well-adjusted, functioning people. And that actually challenged one of the basic things about psychiatry. It challenged the basic myth that homosexuality in and of itself was a mental illness. So we had all that, and I think also the agitation in the street, the proliferation of these small groups, these kind of things that we made, being on TV, being on radio. I was on hundreds of radio shows and dozens of TV appearances in those early years, in the early 60s. And I think it's very much like the Rosa Parks story. You can only keep people beaten down as long as they feel like they're nothing or they have no chance to protest. Consciousness of the black people have been raised to the point of saying, oh, we're really tired of being treated this way. They don't have the right to treat us this way. That's exactly the same thing that happened at Stonewall. So Stonewall, you can say, was a Rosa Parks sitting in the seat and demanding her right to be treated as an equal on the bus. Stonewall is demanding our right to be treated as equals on all levels of society. That was a huge step because it was almost like some sleeping giant woke up, and overnight the movement went from being 50 small organizations to being, I think, 2,500 within 1 year. In the early 60s, or all during the 60s, I was considered a premature gay militant, or as I said, John DeMille called me the first gay militant. And they all asked why I wasn't out in the street when Stonewall happened. Because I had tried reforming the Mattachine Society, and I just gotten tired of these people that still were worrying about, are we sinners or aren't we sinners? You know, are we sick or aren't we sick? It's amazing how the general society has the ability to brainwash people about themselves. We have no strength of character. We're human beings. Human beings are much more subject to the social attitudes in their society than they have the inner strength to be themselves. I'm sometimes asked, what was the personal moment for me as a gay militant or a gay spokesperson? It actually happened in the strangest place. There was an anarchist in the Sex Freedom League. He used to go out with a black and red flag and set up a soapbox. This would have been 1963. So one day, at around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, on MacDougal Street, which is a touristy section of the village, but the village wasn't known for being gay. It certainly wasn't gay at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. It was all these little coffee shops, and people came down to the village to see the bohemians and the artists and the folk singers and all that stuff. So I got up and I said, with my legs shaking, I was frightened, I was shaking. I said, down this street there's a gay bar. I said, and that gay bar is a homosexual bar. And it's run by the mob. And the only way that bar can exist is because they pay off the police. I said, homosexuals should have the right to congregate in their own bars. And they should be able to do that without having to have a corrupt system in which the bar owner is paying off the police. Because bribing the police corrupts the body public politic. And when I got through with that speech, I expected somewhere along the line someone might call and attack me or hoot. Instead, I got a slight pattering of applause because I think people realize that it took nerve to get up and say what I had just said. That was a great moment because people often say, you don't realize in those days we thought if we went out on a street corner and said, I'm a homosexual, we'd be set upon by howling mobs who would kill us on the street. But what I found is that if you went out in society and spoke as a civilized person, making a rational argument in a generalized, proper way, that people, even though they thought you were sick, even though you were a criminal, they would hear you out in the public forum, and they were willing to engage you. I continued on with it. From there, I went to the Hall of Issues at Justin Memorial Church, and I started doing this frequently. I organized the first public protest for gay civil rights outside of the Army Induction Center on Whitehall Street in September 1964. And people often ask me, what was the purpose all these years of that and all these other things I've done? And you know what the purpose really is? Always with me, I've always been a journalist activist. It's to seek the truth, and if I find injustice, to point it out and speak out against it. It's as simple as that. I'm often asked, how did I succeed and how did I fail? I succeeded because I always spoke truth. I failed because I could not bring myself to be politically correct and do the politics speak of whatever happened to be the current LGBT correct political speak. That's how I failed. I failed to be politically incorrect because I'm not politically correct. I'm a true speaker and an activist fighter. Stonewall had an immense effect on how the LGBTI community in the U.S. evolved in the following years. New organizations were born like the Gay Liberation Front, which was very short-lived, and the Gay-Aktivist Alliance. The Street Transvite Action Revolutionary, which was called STAR. They discussed a lot about how to overcome discrimination. And essentially what was born then was Gay-Aktivist Alliance. That is really the organization that changed things. And what technique did Gay-Aktivist Alliance follow? Exactly the technique that I had proposed. They had meetings, Robert Rules of Order. They had demonstrations, ZAPs. They obeyed the law. They worked through sit-ins. They worked to catch the public's attention and tell their story in an entertaining and effective way. And that is really what it was all about. So in the early days, even in GAA, there was a big argument about assimilation versus revolutionary. Oh, we didn't want to have anything with things like marriage. We were going to create our own institutions. We were going to build our own society. That's very much the revolutionary ethos. But what happened is bit by bit, the assimilationist argument completely overwhelmed the revolutionary argument. And bit by bit, the assimilationists came to dominate the movement and to ultimately tell people, I did not become a gay activist to be a legally married man living in the suburbs with a good corporate job between a white picket fence with 2.2 adopted children. No, I became a gay liberationist to be free and to live my life as I felt appropriate. I was never someone who embraced the victim label. I'm not into victimization. My experience as a gay civil rights activist has been just a blessing in my life. I entered the Mattachine Society, and in the Mattachine Society, the president of the Mattachine Society was a self-employed man who ran a small import-export business, who, I went to see him, he could leave the office and go out and have a 2-hour lunch, and I suddenly realized, man, this is the only way to live, to be a self-employed, I like to say self-made man. So that was the first thing that I learned is through the gay movement. I found out the importance of becoming a self-made man. The gay movement began as a gay liberation movement. Then the lesbians came out and it was changed to the LG or the GL movement. And that was the case until 1992, at which point there was a great argument going on whether bisexuals should be allowed into the movement. Around 1992 or 93 they were. I always supported including bisexuals. And after that, the argument about adding the T was much more contentious. That did not actually happen until around 2002 because trans people actually challenged or in conflict in a way with two basic roots of hostility to LGBT people. And that is, those roots are toxic masculinity and misogyny. They are the roots of homophobia. They're the roots of transphobia. Because what it really gets down to is that you can discuss, it was very important for men because they were gay men who may play different sexual roles in bed. That's a real threat to males because males don't like the idea of fluidity of roles in bed, dominance or submission. And when it comes to the whole idea of being flamboyant in dress, for instance, what did homosexuals do when they really got going? First thing they did was dress as clones, which meant leather cap. It was called the clone look. You know, sunglasses, 501 jeans, and a t-shirt. That was the classic look of gay males in the 70s. And why was that? Because we wanted to make sure that no one doubted that gay men were really men. So when trans people came along, the argument became, oh, they say that they're male, or they say that they're female, but that doesn't go along with the cisgender. So the whole idea that one can be both, or one can transition from one to the other, threatens the whole concept of men are real men and women are real women. Matter of fact, the last trans march I saw, the Women's March on Washington, very heavy transgender presence there. I remember one charming person who spoke, they were emphasizing over, I am a woman, I am a woman. And one woman added, I am a woman with a penis. And when did you ever hear that declaration made? So those are the problems that we're getting into in all these transgender debates. And what does that lead to? That really leads to the discussion of what it is to be a male and what it is to be a female. There's no such thing, in my opinion, of male or female. We all begin as female embryos, and ultimately some of us become males. So there's all of us, to some degree, are a mixture of male and female. Most of us are very happy at one end of the spectrum or the other, and identify with our cisgender status. When we start talking about trans issues, you start mixing up not only straight and gay, but also homosexual and heterosexual. Well, there are a lot of men, especially older male men who are married, have a couple of children, suddenly they realize they have a gender identity issue, they transition later in life. Then they go out and they fall into a lesbian relationship with a woman. So a man goes from being a straight man to becoming a lesbian. And likewise, if a lesbian decides that he's trans and becomes a male, she goes from being a lesbian to being a straight man. And this is a very interesting concept to talk about because it mixes up all these categories we have: male, female, straight, gay, because we're all some sort of a complex mixture. And when you start discussing what it is that makes a male or a female, you're really discussing what it is to be a complex human being. The New York Times has some statistic, I don't know how they ever arrived at it. They claim that 19% of transsexuals were heterosexual. Now, I don't know how you identify these things, but this is what made the trans issue such an important issue today, because I think everybody identifies with the argument of what it is that makes a woman or what it is that makes a man, because it actually transitions or transfers itself into you saying, what it is that makes me a male, what is it that makes me a female? And that's why the trans issue has become the dominant, compelling issue of our day. I think the important thing is to realize that gay rights are not separable from human rights. They're part of the human rights spectrum. The most important issue in the world today is the liberation of women. So if you were in a country where if you stood up and said, I'm homosexual, you should change the laws regarding me, you might find yourself killed by a relative to save the family name, hung in Iran, or killed in some other country, locked up and thrown to jail. But a male in another country can stand up and say, women should be allowed to drive, women should be allowed to own a business, women should be allowed to do this or that. So fighting for the human right, part of the human rights spectrum that you can safely fight for. Because one of the things that I worry about is what I call the dangerous myth of Stonewall. And that is that the Stonewall myth is that if there's injustice, you just stand up and you challenge it and you say, no, 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 I'm a human being, I have my rights, and somehow you're gonna win. I remember there was back when they had gay marriage legalized in the United States, there was actually a party in Uganda in which they had a gay wedding on the beach in celebration of Stonewall Gay Liberation Day. That was extremely dangerous because they had just narrowly kept Uganda from passing a law that would have made homosexuality a crime punishable by death. Because some born-again Christians had gone over there and spread their toxic Christianity, and actually finally, because they realized it would put Uganda under the spotlight for various international sanctions, that was defeated. But you don't have to have a law saying that homosexuality is punishable by death, because the reality is in Uganda, if they put your name in a paper, your neighbors will all come down and put you in the middle of the street, put a tire around you, and burn you alive for being gay. So the thing that's important, that's the dangerous myth of Stonewall, is you can only start fighting the battles that you have a chance of winning. There's no point to be a total self-sacrificer. My name is Randy Wicker. I've been a gay activist since 1958. And I'm standing today in front of the famous Stonewall Inn. This is the location where the Stonewall raid took place and where the first massive resistance to a police raid took place in New York City. There had been earlier raids, even 10 years earlier, on bars out in LA, but they got no attention because they were run down this slum area, poor area. They were just poor people fighting back. But here at Stonewall, we were in a middle-class neighborhood, and for that reason it got attention, and the police were on their best behavior, so it really became an event. Now, things were quite different in those days. You didn't have a neon sign. You had a great big sign hanging that said Stonewall. And this area here, which was not a bar at all, this area here, which now is advertising, you know, Stonewall Inn shows, you know, Miss Stonewall 2019 competitions, a whole selection of events that are due to be carried on here. That type of thing did not even exist in the days that Stonewall operated. In the days that Stonewall operated, this was just a blanked up, it was nothing. I don't remember anything being there. I think it was an unused storefront. This is the real Stonewall. This is where you came and you knocked on the door, and there was a little kind of slide thing here, and they would look out and they would decide whether they wanted to let you in or not. And then you would go in here and climb up this rickety bunch of stairs, and that would lead you to, above us, you'll see these windows. Those windows are actually where the Stonewall Bar used to be. That is the real premises of the Stonewall Bar. Today, I think that possibly part of that has been incorporated as the second floor of this existing bar, because the Stonewall wasn't even a bar legally. It had no liquor license. The Stonewall Bar came into activity after the events of Stonewall itself. So the liquor license didn't even exist in those days. This was a bagel shop for about 10 years, and then it turned into the Stonewall Inn, and has since become a landmark. So the real story is that you snuck in the door here, you went upstairs to a dinky little dingy hall, and you had fun with the finger-snapping dancing queens. It was the last dancing bar in New York City, and that's probably another reason why people got really mad when they tried to shut it down, because it was the last dancing bar in New York City.